In 1789, the American Revolution was over, but the fight to define the new republic had just begun. The Constitution was written, the government established, but the future was anything but certain. Nobody could say whether this bold experiment in democracy would survive its infancy. At home, Washington and his administration faced the monumental task of building a financial system, crafting a foreign policy, and setting precedents that would shape the presidency for generations. Abroad, the world was on fire. The French Revolution had erupted, and America was caught between its revolutionary ideals and its desperate need for stability. Washington was on a tightrope. Tonight, we explore the defining challenges of Washington's presidency. How did he navigate the chaos of the French Revolution? What was the impact of his economic and foreign policies? And what, if anything, did he get wrong? This is Washington's presidency. Up next on the Napoleonic Wars Pod.
Hello and welcome back to the Napoleonic Wars Pod and another installment of our presidential series. Or is it the foundation of America?
The
Or
birth
is it...
of America, Zach.
It's the what of America, Josh?
The birth of America,
The
Zach.
birth of America.
Very professional
Okay.
of you to remember that.
Yeah, that was a really nice, smooth introduction, which we will continue to run with as if I knew all of that beforehand and was just testing you.
Well, I'm
Thank
editing
you.
it, so I mean, even if you wanted to edit it out, it's staying in.
Well, it's nice to know I can rely on you, Josh. Thanks for that, pal.
Anytime.
As you can tell, the anarchy continues on this show. I am joined once again by the estimable Provost Marshal, the wielder of the musket, the master of 4 minutes to a round, as opposed to 4 rounds to a minute. That is Josh Redden. He is looking forward to this one, as am I, because we welcome back Peter Kastor. Now, you will have heard Peter last time when we talked about kind of Washington's America, and we did an us, if I'm being honest. We got through half the question list, and we didn't really talk about the presidency at all, which was meant to be the point of the episode. So today we might sort of try and behave ourselves and actually get through the set list of questions. If you're not familiar already, Peter teaches history at Washington University in St. Louis, and he's the author and editor of 8 books on the era of the American Revolution, particularly, though there are many for you to choose from, but particularly Creating the Federal Government, 1789 to 1829, and Washington's Government, State Building for a New Nation, which is available from the University of Virginia Press. Peter, welcome back. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thanks so much for having me back.
So the point of this series was always to kind of talk about presidential behavior, quite why we might suddenly decide to sort of scrutinize the behavior of past presidents. I will leave our listeners to speculate upon. But when it comes to Washington, he's got this reputation as sort of the pinnacle of principle. But as we discussed last time, he's also got these huge problems, not least the debt. And we kind of left it on a not really cliffhanger, but kind of cliffhanger, in that we never sort of really talked about what the Washington administration does in order to tackle that debt. So at the risk of being really predictable and picking up where we left off last time, we'll take that tried and tested model and pick up where we left off last time. So when it comes to this debt, I guess the initial question is, what does Washington seek to do about it? But that in itself is probably the wrong question to ask, because that implies that Washington is the sole person taking the decisions on this. And so I'm very interested to see about and explore the dynamic within his cabinet and his wider team in terms of trying to tackle this problem.
Of course. And before Washington had a solution to the debt, he knew he had to have one. I mean, this was issue number one for his administration. And just as a reminder, with the ratification of the Constitution, one of the pledges from it really was one of the assumptions was that this new federal government would take charge of the debts that states had accumulated during the American Revolution that they'd been unable to pay down and which had actually continued to grow. It was a real mess. And so the administration knew they were going to have to do something about this. The first and most important thing Washington did was to select a group of agency heads. And we now take that for granted. A new president comes into office in the United States. He picks a set of people to run the different agencies of government in the same way that a new prime minister in the UK picks a cabinet. But this was uncertain at that time. And Washington said, I need a group of agency heads. I need them to have general independence in what they do. And what he's famous for doing is picking this extraordinary brain trust. So he selects his first major appointment is Thomas Jefferson as the Secretary of State to run both foreign affairs, but a lot of important domestic responsibilities. Edmund Randolph would be the Attorney General, who was really his principal legal advisor. Henry Knox was the Secretary of War. He was a general who Washington knew well and trusted. But then to your question, Alexander Hamilton, who he knew as a critical aide to him, a military aide during the Revolution, a brilliant attorney, and one of the authors of the Constitution, and the author of the largest number of installments in the Federalist Papers, a series of pamphlets that had made the case for ratifying the Constitution. So he selects Hamilton to tackle this debt problem. And then he lets Hamilton try to figure this out. The first challenge that Hamilton faced was that there were very few sources of revenue for the federal government. It's a completely different time. Most importantly, there's no individual income tax. States levied property taxes on citizens. They would tax them for landed property, personal property, animal property, and human property. These are taxes that average Americans paid to their states, and they were collected at the county level. But of course, the United States just fought a revolution against taxation. So Hamilton has to figure out some way to generate money, to generate revenue, without imposing direct taxes on citizens. And the solution he comes up with to the debt problem is really brilliant. The first part is to say, we actually need to take on more debt. So the United States needs to consolidate its existing debts, needs to negotiate agreements with banks in foreign countries for an influx of money. But in the meantime, there needs to be some way to generate revenue domestically. And the basis of how the federal government raised money was through import duties on foreign goods. So when merchant ships, mostly crossing the Atlantic, would arrive in an American port, New York, Baltimore, Charleston, bringing foreign goods, there would be duties levied on them. And there would be officials in every one of these ports whose task was to board the ship, examine the goods, assess the value, and charge a tax to it. But it's very much what's called an indirect tax because average Americans didn't see it. These taxes would be charged. The merchants would have to pay those taxes, and they just passed the cost on to their customers who never really knew it. They might not know that some wool that came over from the UK, that came over from England, for which someone was paying $10, had actually only been worth $8, but there were $2 of duties assessed to it. It sounds like a very simple system, but it worked really, really well. In 1788, when the Constitution was ratified, these old state debts, you couldn't sell them. They were trading below par. If you owned $100 in debts and you wanted to offload them, you could probably only offload them for about $80. But by 1800, federal debts were selling above par because they were it was a stable instrument, and people by then knew that the federal government was going to pay its debts. We know that eventually the federal government did, but it was a real challenge. It was a real crisis. And one of the first major pieces of legislation for the new federal Congress was the Revenue Act of 1789. There was another one in 1790, And the 1791 really became the foundation for this very elaborate revenue system.
I want to ask a question about Hamilton's financial system and its kind of future beyond the Washington presidency, even if it's kind of outside the scope of this episode. I should say the magic of the Napoleonic Wars podcast is because we don't record episodes in chronological order. Shock horror, another way we do things slightly bizarrely. Because we don't record in chronological order, we've now already dipped into Jefferson's presidency, and in that
Oh,
episode,
wonderful.
yeah. And in that episode, our historian, Andrew Shankman, he expressed his belief that kind of Hamilton's financial system, um, it's sometimes overstated how far it endured, and he kind of emphasized that the the extent to which it was kind of dismantled afterwards. Like a good historian, though, he said others would disagree with him, and from your face, I can tell that you do disagree with him. So I'm interested to hear your version of events in terms of what happens to Hamilton's financial system and its legacy afterwards.
Josh, are you trying to pit our historians against one another?
I wouldn't want to do that, no, but I just thought I should cite my sources rather than just anonymizing him.
That's the incorrect answer. And what you should be saying is yes, absolutely. And I will endorse that approach, which is highly unprofessional and unkind to our guests. But by now, they're probably used to us being mean to them on this show.
Well, I don't know if I wouldn't say I'm being pitted against him as it is a sort of friendly, not even a competition, but a friendly little joust here. So, because I'm a big fan of Andrew Shankman, he's a terrific historian. I understand what he's saying. My approach to thinking about this is that import duties did remain a foundation of federal revenue up until the late 19th century. It's really only in the industrial era when the capacity of the federal government grew significantly beyond what uh, anyone could pay under the old system that things really started to change. And it eventually took a constitutional amendment in the early 20th century before the US had a direct income tax. But I do understand what he's saying, which is that federal leaders experimented with other ways to raise revenue. And one of the first people to do that was Hamilton himself. In 1794, the federal government imposed a direct tax. It was a whiskey excise, and it was wildly unpopular because it wasn't just that people were getting charged more for whiskey, it's that it was a direct tax. And that was tremendously unpopular. It was most apparently so in Western Pennsylvania, where a minor rebellion emerged, and George Washington put his uniform back on, got on horseback, led an army into Western Pennsylvania to put down what everyone talked about as the Whiskey Rebellion or the Whiskey Revolt. So it certainly changed. And in the 18 teens, during the War of 1812, the US once again imposed a direct tax. So there are certainly ways in which the government experimented with other forms of federal revenue. But this indirect tax, these duties on foreign goods, remained a big part of the federal apparatus. There are officials in every port. Their job is to identify foreign goods as they're coming in. Their job is to tax them. And if you look at the federal budget, that's the biggest part of it in terms of revenue. The other thing that would remain the case is that Hamilton's belief that the United States would periodically need to negotiate loans with foreign banks is something that his successors would do. And of course, he's famous for having these disputes with Thomas Jefferson, but in the same way that Hamilton sought to negotiate loans from Dutch banks in the 1790s, Thomas Jefferson did exactly the same thing. In 1803, in the wake of the Louisiana Purchase, which the US couldn't afford, the US depended on loans from, not so much loans, but financing from two major European banks, one of them Dutch and, of course, the other British, which was so odd because the US and Britain were really at odds then. But Hamilton's, I guess that would be my take on it, which is that the the skeleton of Hamilton's plan remained in place. Even when the Jeffersonians came in, they didn't eliminate it. Rather, they experimented with other ways to make revenue. One thing that they also learned, something that Hamilton had hoped and that Jefferson hoped as well, was that the sale of federal lands would be this bonanza for the federal government. It would bring in all this money. It brought in some, but not nearly as much as the administration thought it would.
Can I ask about the image of the representative, the figurehead of the executive branch, putting on a uniform? Granted, he's a former soldier. He's the darling of America because he is the US's most successful soldier at that moment in time. But he's also the president. And you have a situation here where the president is heading up an army, much as you might expect a sort of autocratic king to head up an army, and is marching into a region of the United States that is protesting about taxation. Okay, in this case, taxation with some representation, but nonetheless, the issue here is taxation, and seeks to put down this revolt. It's, if you wanted to, you could very easily spin a monarchical autocratic narrative to that series of actions. So how does Washington navigate that potential to just open himself up to a whole series of allegations that he is king in all but name?
How does he navigate it? Not well, is what I would say. And many people look to Washington to see a lot of the elements of the template for the American presidency. And one of them is the second term is usually much more difficult than the first. And Washington ran into that. He had a more difficult second term. And this is one of the moments when he really stumbled. He struggled when he faced real opposition. He didn't quite know how to navigate that himself. It's partly because he'd been a general. It's also because he was a Virginia planter. He was used to having people defer to him. And so when he led those troops there, that was one of the reasons why a growing number of political officials in the United States began to worry about him. Some of them said it's not his fault. It's the people around him. He's getting bad advice. They blame Hamilton for this, actually, because Hamilton's still in the cabinet. They say he's the one misleading Washington. And there are other people saying that as well. And it's one of the reasons why, though, in 1795, 1796, George Washington, who really had to be pressured into running for re-election in 1792, said, I'm finished with this. I'm out. And there were members of Congress who were eager to see that. Now, I want to be clear, he was still wildly popular, but some of the shine had worn off of him. And the Washington that we know now, who Americans especially tend to think of as this truly beloved and adored figure in his lifetime, is one that was really created after he left office, because people recognized that he was such a powerful symbol for the most important values of the United States. Washington had sustained those values during his presidency. I want to be clear about that. But he did find during his second term that he faced more criticism, more doubts, and it was painful for him to go through that.
Let's move towards the kind of foreign policy, which is something else I'd like to talk about. Because the big news of Washington's presidency is in the first year, is the French Revolution. And it goes without saying that Americans who've had a revolution in their lifetimes must have watched events in France with a wide variety of emotions. What kinds of reactions did the revolution cause in the United States? And I'm especially interested in hearing about its leading kind of politicians. So that's Washington, right, Hamilton, Jefferson.
The usual suspects, and rightly so. One way to think about it is that the French Revolution and the wars that it produced really defined both the foreign policy and the domestic policy of the United States until the fall of Napoleon. You cannot talk about the United States during this period without talking about the revolution and the wars that came from it. And there were really important domestic policy debates in the United States. Washington came into office, and the people around him were deeply concerned about the fate of the Union. They saw it as a fragile union. Their job was to preserve a domestic union. That's what they would focus on. They needed to have some degree of legal continuity from state to state. There also were internal political divisions that in the mid-1790s produced two parties, the first two parties in the United States. But with that said, foreign policy didn't just drive the administration, it drove domestic policy. So I just mentioned Hamilton's financial plan built on duties on foreign goods. Think about how much that would be responding to developments in the Atlantic world. You cannot have duties on foreign goods unless you have active trade with other countries. You can't have active trade with other countries if you don't have treaties and arrangements with them. And there are two foreign policy crises that face the United States, or rather, there are two areas of foreign policy crisis. One is in the Atlantic, and that's really about the French Revolution. How's the United States going to operate in the Atlantic world? But then that's in the East. Then there's another set of crises in the West. To the southwest of the United States, Spain claimed land that the United States claimed as well. This is a source of tension throughout Washington's term. In the same way that he wanted treaties with France and Britain, he very much wanted a treaty with Spain. And, as I always say, Washington comes into office, the United States is already at war. There's a war between this new union of the United States and a new union of native polities that had formed in the land that's now Ohio and Indiana. And the U.S. was losing. This is a war the U.S. is losing in a series of disastrous campaigns that the United States Army attempted to take into what's now the Midwest of the U.S. And the U.S. didn't emerge from that victorious until about 1794. So what I would emphasize in this is that foreign policy is tremendously important. Military policy, tremendously important. That's the way the US was dealing with it. Now, how do they deal with the French Revolution? With uncertainty. That's one of the big questions facing the administration. What will the position of the United States be relative to this new regime? And we know, of course, that the revolution raised all these questions about freedom and liberty and democracy, and that's what we tend to focus on. But there was a very practical question. The United States had treaties with the French government. Would those treaties still be in force with this new regime that was in place? And Washington wasn't certain. Thomas Jefferson, who was supposed to be overseeing US foreign relations and who had just been the minister to France, he didn't know. He wasn't certain if they would remain in place. Alexander Hamilton was deeply worried that the revolution might generate turmoil in Atlantic trade, which would undermine his financial plan. And Henry Knox was always worried that conflict in Europe could lead to conflict in the United States. And he knew that his army could not fight a European army.
Is there any sense of sniffiness over different factions of the revolution? I know sniffiness is a highly technical term, as people immediately jump for the comments to lambast me for it. But the revolution, I mean, even historians of the French Revolution sit back and go, the French Revolution is really hard to work out in terms of what the hell is going on. And it just sort of descends through these sort of spirals of chaos until it sort of, well, you get the Thermidorian reaction, but really that's kind of just a case of everybody's dead and we're all exhausted. So is there a sense as these folks, whether it's Washington, Jefferson, Adams, etc., look on from their side of the Atlantic, that actually this is something that needs to be kept at arm's length, because it might be a revolution and it might have started out as a sort of anti-monarchical regime, but actually when you've gone through Robespierre and you've gone through all of the terror and all the rest of it, this is just a bit kind of too radical and we want to keep that away from us. Is there a kind of a shift as the revolution goes on?
Absolutely. What I'll say is that when the revolution erupts, a lot of Americans saw it as they would continue to see it through their own experience. They said, we had a revolution. This is a revolution. We understand why people would reject monarchy. So they start with a certain guarded optimism about it, and they kind of take credit for it. That's what Americans do. But then there is exactly the reaction you discussed. There is one of concern and later of fear and real shock at the violence they see coming from it. Americans then do exactly what you'd expect, which is we got it right. We got revolution right. So they do draw that lesson from it. They say the way we went about it is the way you should do these things. The French don't know how to do this. They actually end up concluding that the problem is with France and with its whole political society. The other thing that happens really from the start is that there are disagreements about who the US should side with, not just in the revolution, but especially after the war erupts. And this is the classic division. There are some Americans who say the US should side with France because it is the revolutionary regime. They still support that. They see it as the weaker regime and therefore less threatening to them. And most importantly, it's not Britain, who's still the enemy. There are other Americans who say, we've separated from Britain, but we have long-standing relations. The majority of us are descended from peoples of the British Isles. We've got trade relationships with them that we want to increase, not decrease. And of course, this is what's going to fuel the party split in the United States. So when I said that foreign policy shapes domestic policy, this is an example of it. Americans begin to disagree about it. It's just disagreement. These aren't political parties yet. They start having meetings about this. They form societies that will argue this in public. These still aren't parties. But then in 1794, George Washington dispatches John Jay, the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, to Britain to negotiate a treaty. And that treaty is so wildly unpopular among some Americans. They say we need to organize, we need to mobilize, we need to get members of the Senate to reject this treaty. The treaty does eventually get ratified by the Senate. But that treaty, the Jay Treaty, is really what will produce the first two parties. The Federalists, who see themselves as the party of Washington, although Washington himself stays above the fray, and then these other people. Sometimes they're called Jeffersonians, sometimes Democratic Republicans. Eventually, they'll just be called the Republicans. This is all a result of the French Revolution and the wars, and it also speaks to how Americans disagree. They disagree in one other way, or there's one other concern they've got about the revolution. Of course, as the revolution takes form in France, it inspires other political movements. The first is the revolutionary movement among the free people of color in the French colony of Saint-Domingue, who in the early 1790s start saying we need to reform the empire. And we are free members of the French Empire, and we should be able to govern ourselves. We should be part of some larger imperial system. This is before there's a slave revolt. But as soon as this starts, members of the administration, whether they are from free states or slave states, look at this with horror. They see this at the beginning of a racial revolt. And when the slave revolt begins in Saint-Domingue, they respond with horror at this because, of course, they're deathly afraid that a slave revolt in the Caribbean will spread to a slave revolt in the United States. And they worry about this because refugees from Saint-Domingue are arriving in the United States, mostly in Charleston. There are both Euro-Americans, free Afro, you wouldn't call them African Americans, but rather they're Afro-Caribbeans, and then enslaved Afro-Caribbeans. They're all arriving mostly in Charleston, and it's a big policy question. Will we let them in? What are we going to do about this? And it's another example of the unanticipated consequences of the French Revolution, and frankly, the ways that the revolution and the war just drive American politics and policy.
You've raised that question now, and I'm too intrigued to not kind of follow it with this issue of people from the Caribbean arriving on the shores of Charleston and the question of what are they going to do with them. Can you kind of go into a little bit more detail about that and
Or,
explain what is the actual policy decision?
of course. So let's begin with the fact that there were no restrictions, there were no legal restrictions on the importation of enslaved people into the United States. The Constitution, in fact, prohibited that until 1808. 1808 rolls around, Congress ends U.S. involvement in the foreign slave trade. But it's completely legal for people to bring their enslaved property into the United States. The United States had a naturalization law that provided for a process whereby immigrants would become citizens. It had no immigration law. There were almost no restrictions on who could immigrate into the United States. So when these refugees arrived, the administration became worried. But there were also a lot of South Carolinians who said, oh my goodness, here's a whole new group of enslaved people who we can buy. And their arrival is going to lower the price for the enslaved. So at a time when South Carolina's economy is booming, because the US economy is booming, planters see this influx of underpriced supply, so they support this. The big question is what will become of these free Black people from Saint Domingue? And a number of them are prosperous. Many of them own enslaved people in their own right. And what they find when they arrive in South Carolina is that they have far fewer economic opportunities and far greater social restrictions. South Carolina also had a population of free people of color. And there were elaborate rules in every slave state that would say what slaves could do and couldn't do, but also what free people of color could and could not do. The other large group, by the way, of Saint Domingue refugees went to New Orleans, and they became a very important part of the society and economy in late colonial Louisiana.
Can I ask about the expansionism debate? Because we love really kind of simple and easy to answer questions on this show that are in no way wildly broad. It's something that comes up quite a bit on this show. If we cover the War of 1812, then inevitably we end up sort of delving into this question about Canada as, you know, a colony and a state in waiting, you know, something that's a British colony that just needs to sort of see the light and sort of be folded into the US system. You've also got the fact that you've got an insecure is perhaps the wrong way to put it, but a border to the south of these colonies that's in flux, right? Because of situation in Florida. We all know that the Louisiana Purchases are admittedly going to be something for another administration to consider. America is also looking to move westward. And you've sort of touched on some of that already in regards to that war that the US fundamentally isn't winning until 1794. So where are the areas of discussion, the focal points, I guess, of this debate in terms of, is anybody kind of saying, no, actually, let's just kind of hunker down and build up in the regions that we currently occupy?
Actually, I think that's what the majority of policymakers were doing. And you said it's a complicated question, and you're right. I do tend to start with a rather simple take on it, which is we all know what's going to happen. We know the US will invade Mexico in 1846. The US will seize land from Spain in 1898. And there will be this kind of exuberant territorial expansionism in the later 19th century. And so we tend to read that backward into the 1790s. And I think the result is that we tend to overstate the expansionism of the US as a government. The way I think hunker down is the right way to think about it. One of the principal policy goals of the Washington and Adams administrations was to consolidate the land that the US claimed. So the US claimed land from the Atlantic to the Mississippi River. But much of that land, once you got west of the Appalachian Mountains, are what we would call borderlands. Multiple people and multiple governments claimed them. So the goal of the United States in the 1790s for the land northwest of the Ohio River is to extinguish Native American claims to that land. Even though Native Americans had been living there and were the governing authority and had been for centuries. But the US sets out to extinguish that sovereignty. Likewise, southwest of the Ohio River, the United States is focused in this area where you not only have native governance, but you also have Spanish, not just Spanish claims, but Spanish governance. And so, but the US said, but we got that land through the Treaty of Paris. We should have that land. And so the administration sets out to sign treaties that will consolidate that. And 1795 is the year this all comes together. In 1795, the Senate ratified the Jay Treaty, which was mostly a commercial treaty between the US and Britain, but it also had provisions through which Britain abandoned some of its claims to land that the US claimed. It established a boundary between the US and Canada. The British also forswore any participation and support for Native Americans at war with the United States on American land. So it's very, very important in that sense. So that treaty solved some of these Western problems. One of the consequences is that British officials who knew this treaty was coming refused to support and to shelter the Native Americans fighting with the United States. It's one of the reasons they lose in this war. And in 1795, a series of Native governments signed a major treaty with the US through which they ceded a lot of land and also made arrangements to acknowledge US claims to other lands. Also in 1795, the US signed a landmark treaty with Spain, the Treaty of San Lorenzo, through which Spain ceded most of what's now Mississippi and Alabama, and most importantly for the Americans, guaranteed American rights to trade down the length of the Mississippi River, to deposit their goods in New Orleans so they could then be transshipped overseas. What I want to emphasize in all of this is not just that foreign policy remained important with all of these European powers and with native powers, not just that foreign policy was driving domestic policy, but also that Americans were very cautious about expanding the boundaries of the United States. That said, American settlers were not cautious about expanding the extent of their settlement. They were flooding across the Appalachian Mountains into the land that is now Ohio, Indiana, Mississippi, Alabama. They were already in Kentucky and Tennessee. They will eventually apply tremendous pressure on the federal government to acquire new land. But in the 1790s, the early 1800s, the US wasn't seeking new land. My favorite example of that is the Louisiana Purchase. We know what the Jefferson administration wanted in 1803 because they put it in writing. The instructions to James Monroe said, get New Orleans, get the Gulf Coast, and get the Florida Peninsula, because that will consolidate our hold east of the Mississippi River without the challenges of expanding west of the Mississippi. It's the French who say, we will only sell you our land west of the Mississippi River and nothing else.
Can I ask a question about Washington's personal views on the kind of the Western question? Because, I mean, perhaps that checks out to me in the abstract, but what do we know about kind of Washington's own feelings then towards this question of what lies beyond the Western Mississippi River? Because I get the impression that perhaps some people would disagree with you on this.
Oh, some of them would totally disagree with me, and they include people I really respect. The West that mattered most to Washington throughout his entire adult life was actually the Trans-Appalachian West. And he had been there. He had been a surveyor. He loved traveling into the West. As a militia officer fighting with the British in the 7 Years' War, he, of course, had been to the area near Pittsburgh. So he'd been out there. And like many of the people around him, the leading officials of the United States, they saw tremendous opportunity for Americans in the land between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River, because they really did believe in freedom and equality and independence. And they knew that for many people, the foundation of independence, the basis of equality was, did you own land? If you owned land, you owned your own vote. if you owned land, no one was better than you. If you owned land, you were independent. The problem, of course, was that people like Washington owned most of the land east of the Appalachian Mountains. And so when they looked at places like Western Kentucky, Western Tennessee, Western Pennsylvania, and Ohio, they said, this is where equality is going to happen. This is where independence is going to happen. Washington himself had some interest in the land west of the Mississippi River. He really was quite interested in that. Jefferson's the one who's really interested in that. He had a deep scientific interest. He wanted to know the topography. He wanted to know about the natural landscape. The other thing that starts happening in the 1790s and really starts during the Washington administration is an awareness that there was a very lucrative fur trade on the Missouri and Columbia rivers. And they knew about British fur traders, French fur traders, and large numbers of Native Americans who were part of that. And they wanted that action. They wanted to be part of that trade system. But I want to emphasize, they wanted to be part of that trade system. They did not yet want to acquire that land.
I don't really want to start moving us towards a conclusion on this, but I suppose we should sort of allow you to actually enjoy the rest of your life and not spend eternity just podcasting with us. So with that in mind, I want to start kind of thinking about sort of legacies and implications in terms of precedents. The most obvious one here is that Washington's a two-termer, and that in part through the constitutional amendment will become something that is or well, depends when people are listening to this, quite frankly, as to whether it is or was an aspect of the Constitution that is honoured. Certainly, there are manoeuvrings going on to try and change that with the current administration, but obviously that's important and has been important for 250 years of US history. Okay, Roosevelt, sure, FDR, like important caveat there, but for the most part, this has been something that's stayed. I guess you've also alluded to this earlier in terms of Washington coming in and appointing agency heads, kind of the equivalent of a cabinet. What else is there in terms of Washington doing certain things, behaving in a certain way, making particular decisions that ends up becoming the yardstick through which the presidency increasingly sort of sets up a series of traditions and what's the word I'm looking for? Almost like a kind of common law, I guess, a common law way of approaching presidential business.
Right. I think that's a great question. A term we heard a lot in the US during the first Trump administration was norms. What are the norms of presidential behavior? And it's astonishing how many of them go all the way back to Washington. You know, you mentioned FDR. It took something as extraordinary as the overlap of the Great Depression and World War II for an American president to think it was appropriate to run for a third term. And that was all because of Washington. And it's tremendously important. Some of these I know are some items I mentioned the last time I was on, but I think they're worth reviewing. Washington established the title Mr. President, that the president should be addressed as an average citizen. Washington established the notion that even though he was a general, as president, he would dress like a civilian. And the first formal portrait he gets of himself as president is in a simple black suit. All of these are tremendously important. One of Washington's great innovations wasn't just establishing these agency heads, but in 1793, seeing real value in getting them all in the same room. The idea that the president brings his cabinet together and they have a meeting, they hash out difficult questions, they argue, they debate. The president's job is to listen and decide, not to dictate. There's a terrific historian named Lindsay Chervinsky, who was the first person to really piece this together. And appropriately enough, she now runs the Washington Library at Mount Vernon. But The moment that many people talk to about when the cabinet system worked its best was during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the notion that John Kennedy would get his advisors in the room and they would figure things out and he would guide them but not dictate things. That's straight out of George Washington's playbook. So all of these, not just leaving after 2 terms, but leaving voluntarily. He was really the first person to do that. There was no tradition of political leaders doing that. They usually were toppled or they died in office. All of that was the case. So these are all reasons why, as I said previously about Washington, when we spoke before, he faced a lot of decisions. He could have made a lot of really bad decisions. His gut instinct was really good in many of these situations. And other Americans saw that. They saw that when he was president, when he left, and especially when he died. The big question facing Americans was, how was the US going to institutionalize its values? And how were they going to teach the next generation? And the first person to realize that was an author named Parson Weems is what he went by. That Parson was his nickname because he wrote partly for the religious trade, but his full name was Mason Locke Weems. And in 1799, the year in which Washington died, Weems published a biography called The Life of Washington. And it would seem very strange to us now because he spent very little time on the presidency. It was mostly about the revolution. But at the end of it, he has a whole section called George Washington's Virtues. And the idea is that young people would read it, they would internalize it, they would learn it. And some of the most important virtues he saw in Washington were his faith, his humility, and his honesty. And he didn't have an easy way to teach those abstract concepts, so he made up a story. And this is something that American school children have learned for generations. The story of the cherry tree. And the cherry tree myth is that when he was a boy, George Washington chopped down a cherry tree, and his father said, "Did you chop down my cherry tree?" And George Washington said, "I cannot tell a lie, I did." And his father said, "I forgive you 1,000 times over for doing this." And the lesson is that children should be honest. And it was taught through Washington. The other lesson was about Washington's father. His father plays a really big part in this book because it's supposed to be an instruction manual for young men about how they can be good fathers for their sons. So from day one, Washington became the symbolic American. John Marshall, this incredibly important American Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, the one who really made the Supreme Court what it is, he wrote a multi-volume biography of Washington because he idolized him so much. The university where I work, Washington University in St. Louis, named itself for Washington in the 1850s because he was the symbol of the Union in the years before the Civil War. And in the 1870s, when that union had just been restored, the federal government said, "We're going to make a holiday for George Washington. And it's going to remind Americans of the importance of Washington and of our union." It's now celebrated as President's Day because everyone's got their favorite president. But the point was, well, why not do that? Because Washington is the ideal president.
Safe to say Washington got a lot right, but on the other hand, American history doesn't end in 1799, and the few decades afterwards are an incredibly turbulent period in American history. So I'm interested to hear, Peter, to your mind, is there anything that Washington got wrong or got particularly wrong in his 8 years as president? And if so, what is it, and what bearing does it have on America afterwards, do you think?
Of course. So these aren't so much areas, it's not just areas where Washington got things wrong, but where he was totally on the wrong side of history. So Washington was an unapologetic slaveholder. He was one of the wealthiest presidents in US history, and his wealth rested on a foundation of human suffering. He owned hundreds of people over the course of his lifetime. When he died, He did provide for the manumission. In his will, he provided for the manumission of the enslaved people who he owned, but he knew that the majority of the enslaved people at Mount Vernon were owned through a trust that had been created for his wife because it was on land that had been owned by her family. And so he knew that people would remain enslaved and that Martha Washington would still have slaves and their descendants would as well. And he took comfort in that. So he could never accommodate himself to a United States without slavery. He could not accommodate himself to racial equality. He just couldn't think that way. During the Revolution, about half the states in the Union began the first great manumission, the first great emancipation. As northern states moved toward the gradual emancipation of slavery, Washington was fine with that, but he couldn't imagine a United States without slavery. One of his great successes as president was the military victory over the native confederacies in the West, because Washington believed that the land between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River needed to be open for Euro-American settlement. He had no qualms about that. He believed the United States needed to negotiate in good faith with Native Americans, but he did not think Native Americans were really part of the United States. They weren't independent, but they weren't Americans. He could never imagine a multiracial United States. And it isn't, one thing people often say is, look, he did all this stuff right, and oh yeah, there's something wrong with him. I tend not to see it that way, and I don't teach it that way. You can't have one without the other. Washington couldn't imagine all of this independence and opportunity for settlers without imagining the removal of Native Americans off land where white settlers wanted to go. Washington couldn't be this independent politician without the wealth he had from enslaved African Americans. And Washington couldn't believe that every Virginian was equal without slavery. Because in the UK, there was an aristocracy with peasants. There were no peasants in the United States, but there were slaves. And the absence of peasants the absence of white peasants enabled Washington to think all white citizens were equal and he was no better than them. So there were other things that Washington got wrong. He made some bad policy decisions here and there. I think he misunderstood the French Revolution and he was a little too eager to sign on in a sort of quasi-alliance with the British. But to me, the big issue with Washington, the thing he got wrong, where he's on the wrong side of history, is for all of his inventiveness, for all of his creativity, his inability to imagine a multiracial United States is sort of a staggering element of his life and his presidency.
Peter, I am once again thoroughly impressed. Thank you for returning to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Peter Kastor teaches history at Washington University in St. Louis and is the author editor of 8 books on the era of the American Revolution. Please do check out his Creating the Federal Government project, which we will have a dedicated episode on soon enough, and also any number of the books that he's edited or written. You can check them out in the description. Anyway, we have been the Napoleonic Wars podcast, and we will be back very soon.
Folks, do me a favor. Go review the show. Do it right now. 5 stars, please, and a comment. It takes you seconds, but it sends the algorithm wild and catapults us up the rankings. It's the single most powerful thing that you can do to support the hours of content that we provide for free. Love the show? Never want to miss the latest news? Sign up to our newsletter. The link is in the description, and get regular Napoleonic bulletins direct to your inbox. Looking for a present for the Napoleonicist in your life? We have a shop packed with Napoleonic Wars pod merch. Again, the link is in the description. And did you know you can now gift memberships to Patreon perks that we offer? So if you want to treat someone to our online course, exclusive meetups with authors, green room access to recordings, and exclusive episodes, head to patreon.com/NapWarsPod to find out more. Much love to all our Patreon supporters who are enjoying a rejuvenated and revitalized offering of the perks on Patreon. As I say, head to patreon.com/the Napoleonic Wars pod to find out how you can join a buzzing community of like-minded Napoleonic nerds who are enjoying things like courses, socials, a book club, green room access to recordings, early releases, exclusive episodes, and much more besides. Their support is empowering us to vastly increase our output and keep you entertained with Napoleonic nerdery on an almost daily basis. Prices start from just £2 a month, so if you can spare the cost of a cup of coffee each month to support us, it would mean a huge amount and might even fund some more documentary work. Shout outs to our patrons who, at the time of recording in January of 2024, were in the mentioned in dispatches tier: Rob Griffith, Brendan Teeling, Beatrice DeGraff, Lynn Dawson, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Colin Fieldhouse, Stephen Colson, Jim Getz, Stephen Gillen, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meakin, Mark Anscombe, Rob Coughlin, Bruins Girl, Noah Fink, Miles Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Chris Pramas, Anthony Gumbau, Anonymous American, James Fluick, Natasha Hobday, Rod Schwager, Chris Kimball, Gary Dennis, Ted Andrews, Richard Anderson, Arthur Forgy, Sam Moore, Wyatt Pollock, Carol Dixon-Smith, Roland Shark, Giovanni, Jean-Baptiste Van Merlen, Darla Vincent, Brendan Hogan, Peter Findlay, Jeff Maple, Ian Harding, Indiana Fats, Joe Ayres, Robin Brasher, and Daniel Fieldman. The Admirals, Mark Chestnut, John Haynes, Mike Guest, Rachel Stark, Mark Duckers, David Priest, David Maxwell, Graham Callister, Sean Sullivan, Stephen Ashworth, Kate Walcombe, Clemens Beman, Charles McKay, Reto the Sci-Fi Fan, Tim Day, Jason Moran, Tim Pritchard, and Seth Hansen. The Chiefs of Staff, Adam Coslin, the Marshals, Ryan Diamond and JC Kaiser, the Legion of Scholars, Dan Hazelwood and Bob Burnham, and in the Crown Yourself tier, Emperor of the First French Empire Todd Campbell and the Duke of Wellington, Laird Campbell. We'll be back very soon, but until then, this has been the Napoleonic Wars pod. On behalf of myself, Liam, Luke, Josh, and Zoe, take care of yourselves, folks. Stay well, and as always, thank you for listening.
Thank you.